What happens when a plane mocked as a clumsy experiment in Europe becomes the deadliest hunter in the Pacific? At first sight, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning didn't look like a fighter at all. Its twin booms stretched out like skeletal arms, the cockpit dangling between them, a bizarre silhouette against the sky. German pilots who encountered it in early skirmishes over Europe laughed at its shape, certain that this strange contraption could never match the sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Some even called it a flying fork. To them it was an oddity, slow to roll, awkward in a dogfight, a mistake in metal. But the battlefield has a cruel way of redefining reputations. In the wide, endless reaches of the Pacific, where islands were scattered like stepping stones across a hostile ocean, the Lightning's long legs and heavy guns told a different story. Out there, range mattered more than grace, and firepower meant survival. The same airplane that drew laughter in Europe became the machine that escorted bombers over vast stretches of water, struck deep behind enemy lines, and hunted down Japanese aircraft with deadly precision. And at its most dramatic moment, the Lightning would carry out a mission so audacious, so precise, that it altered the psychology of an entire empire. How did this ungainly twin-tailed joke become the weapon that stalked the Pacific and made history? In the late 1930s, as shadows gathered over Europe, the United States found itself in a precarious position. The old isolationist dream, the belief that oceans could shield America from foreign wars, was beginning to collapse under the weight of modern air power. Bombers could fly farther, fighters were faster, and entire nations could be crippled not by armies crossing borders, but by squadrons raining destruction from the sky. The Army Air Corps looked across the Atlantic and saw German aircraft carving paths through Poland and France. They understood that the wars of the future would not be fought only in trenches, but high above them, across continents and seas. And so they demanded something bold, something entirely new. A fighter that could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything the world had seen. Lockheed, a company known for daring designs, stepped forward with a radical proposal. Instead of a traditional fuselage, their engineers drew a twin-boomed machine with engines mounted in each narrow tail and a cockpit suspended like a pod between them. It was strange, futuristic, even unsettling to look at. The design promised speed beyond 400 miles per hour, a climb that could reach the thin blue ceiling of the sky, and range that stretched into territories once reserved for bombers. In its nose, the engineers concentrated all the firepower, 4 heavy .50 caliber machine guns and a cannon, that would spit a storm of lead directly where the pilot aimed. When the prototype lifted off in 1939, some observers marveled, others laughed. To the casual eye, it looked ungainly. German intelligence, when it first glimpsed the silhouette, nicknamed it a curiosity, a machine unlikely to challenge the sleek predators already ruling the skies. The Luftwaffe had spent years perfecting its Bf-109, a compact, agile, deadly fighter that excelled in the European environment of short ranges and quick engagements. Against that standard, the Lightning seemed overbuilt, clumsy, too ambitious for its own good. And when the first Lightnings entered combat in Europe, those doubts seemed justified. The aircraft struggled in the cold, its systems freezing at high altitude. Pilots complained of heavy controls and tight dogfights. German aces, already seasoned by years of battle, mocked its strange twin tail and sluggish maneuvers. To them, it was just another example of American over-engineering, a machine unsuited for the brutal knife fights over the fields of France or the gray skies of Germany. Laughter and scorn came easily, for on that front, the Lightning was not yet at home. But war is not decided by appearances alone, and sometimes the battlefield itself chooses the weapon. For while Europe tested the Lightning and found it wanting, the Pacific was calling. Out there, distance ruled everything. Islands were scattered like lonely stepping stones across an ocean larger than all of Europe combined. A single mission could stretch hundreds of miles with nothing but water beneath a pilot's wings. For bombers and fighters alike, range was not a luxury, it was survival. Engines failed, fuel tanks leaked, weather changed, and if you could not reach land again, the sea swallowed you whole. In this vast expanse, the Lightning's odd shape became a blessing. 2 engines gave pilots a measure of security. If one failed, the other could carry them home. Large fuel tanks let the aircraft stretch farther than single-engine fighters like the Spitfire or the early Warhawks. And once it reached its target, its nose-mounted guns concentrated fire with devastating precision, without the convergence problems that wing-mounted weapons often faced. It was not the nimblest dogfighter, but it was a predator designed to travel great distances and strike hard when it arrived. By 1942, as the war in the Pacific raged after Pearl Harbor, the United States desperately needed such a machine. Japanese fighters like the nimble Zero had dominated the early months, using their agility and range to humiliate Allied squadrons. American pilots found themselves outmatched, their aircraft lacking the reach or maneuverability to survive long against seasoned Japanese opponents. The morale was shaken, and the balance of air power tilted dangerously in favor of the rising sun. Into this theater came the P-38 Lightning. At first, it arrived quietly, assigned to distant outposts in Alaska and the Aleutians, where freezing winds and endless fog mirrored some of the troubles it had faced in Europe. But even there, pilots began to see its promise. The Lightning could fly in conditions that grounded other planes. It could cover distances across empty seas that would have doomed a single-engine fighter. Slowly, the reputation of this ungainly twin-tailed machine began to change. And yet, many still doubted. The German aces had laughed, the Japanese had yet to fear it, and even some American crews were skeptical. It was fast, yes, but awkward. It was powerful, yes, but large. Could it really survive in the swirling chaos of the Pacific, where every sortie was a gamble and every dogfight a test of nerve? That was the paradox of the P-38 at the dawn of its career. In Europe it was scorned. In America it was unproven. And in the Pacific, it was about to face the ultimate trial by fire. The battlefield would soon reveal whether this strange twin-boomed aircraft was an accident of design or a weapon destined to carve its name into the history of air warfare. Because as the war dragged on, and the Pacific became the central arena of America's fight, the Lightning would rise from curiosity to legend. Its long range would carry it into missions no other fighter could attempt. Its heavy guns would give pilots the ability to cut through enemies with brutal force. And in time, it would not only escort bombers and sweep the skies, but also strike at the very heart of the Japanese command. The men who once mocked it would not be laughing for long. The Pacific was an unforgiving teacher. Pilots who had trained in the calm skies of California suddenly found themselves staring at endless horizons of blue, where a single cloud bank could swallow an entire squadron, and where the nearest runway might be 3 hours away. In this vast theater, survival meant not only defeating the enemy, but also mastering the ocean, the weather, and the limits of your own machine. The Lightning arrived into this crucible in 1942, and almost immediately, it began to reveal what set it apart. Pilots accustomed to single-engine fighters felt a strange comfort when they pushed the throttles forward and heard two engines roar instead of one. That redundancy was more than a technical feature. It was a lifeline. In a theater where mechanical failure often meant ditching into hostile waters, the P-38's twin engines meant the difference between vanishing without a trace and making it back to base. Veterans recalled missions where one engine was shot to silence, yet the other carried them hundreds of miles home. In the Pacific, that resilience bred confidence. But it wasn't only endurance that made the Lightning unique. When the first combat engagements came, pilots discovered a weapon system unlike anything they had flown before. Instead of mounting guns in the wings, Lockheed engineers had placed all of the P-38's armament directly in its nose. 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns alongside a 20mm cannon. In practice, this meant that every bullet, every shell traveled straight ahead, converging on the target without the spread and guesswork common to wing-mounted fighters. In the hands of a determined pilot, the Lightning could unleash a torrent of fire so concentrated that even a brief burst could tear apart a bomber or shred a nimble Zero. The first shock to the enemy came in the skies around Guadalcanal. The Japanese Zero had long been seen as invincible in dogfights, its light frame and tight turning ability overwhelming American pilots flying older aircraft. But the Lightning refused to play by those rules. Its pilots were taught to avoid turning duels and instead use the aircraft's greatest strength, speed in a dive and climb. When a Zero approached, a P-38 could simply nose down, accelerate past 400 miles per hour, and escape, or just as easily, zoom upward into the thin air where the Japanese fighter could not follow. On one of those early missions, squadrons of Lightnings intercepted a formation of bombers headed toward American positions. Japanese escorts dove to protect their charges, expecting an easy victory. Instead, the twin-tailed fighters slashed through the formation with brutal efficiency. Nose guns raked across bombers, engines burst into flame, and when Zeros tried to pursue, they found themselves unable to match the raw power of the Lightning's climb. For the first time, Japanese crews realized they were facing an opponent that did not fear them, a machine that changed the tempo of the fight. Word began to spread. Pilots who had laughed at the Lightning's bulk now whispered about its speed and firepower. Commanders who doubted its value started assigning it to the most critical missions: long-range escorts, high-altitude patrols, deep strikes into enemy territory. The aircraft was no longer an experiment, it was a weapon reshaping the battle. Still, the Lightning demanded respect, even from its own crews. Its engines ran hot in tropical climates, and managing them required discipline. Cockpits could become stifling, with sunlight turning the canopy into an oven. Pilots learned to live with the discomfort, sweat streaming down their faces as they guided the aircraft through 8-hour missions. Fatigue gnawed at them, but the Lightning kept going, its tanks carrying them farther and farther over the Pacific. And then came the missions that truly proved its worth: long-distance intercepts where no other fighter could even attempt to follow. Bombers heading toward Japanese strongholds needed cover, and the Lightning was the only aircraft that could meet them there. Time and again, Lightnings lifted from island airstrips, their twin tails glinting in the sun, climbing to altitude and setting course for enemy territory. Hours later, they would fall upon Japanese formations with the fury of hunters who had traveled across half the ocean to deliver their strike. For the Japanese pilots, the shock was growing. They had grown accustomed to fighting Americans on their own terms, outmaneuvering slower, shorter-ranged planes. The Lightning turned the tables. It could fight when it chose, disengage when it wished, and always seemed to have the fuel to return. No longer could the Zero dictate the pace of battle. Suddenly, it was the Americans who held the initiative. The mocking laughter that had once followed the Lightning began to fade. Reports of its kills grew with every month. Squadrons that had once been plagued by losses now felt the tide turning. And back in Europe, where German aces still scoffed at the Lightning's record, they had little idea that on the far side of the world, this clumsy twin-tailed machine was quietly building a legend. The war in the Pacific was far from over. The enemy was resourceful, determined, and still deadly. But with the arrival of the P-38, the balance of fear had shifted. For the first time, Japanese airmen were forced to look up into the sky, see those distinctive twin tails on the horizon, and ask themselves a new question. How do you fight an enemy that can reach you anywhere, strike with overwhelming force, and vanish before you can touch it? The answer would haunt them for the rest of the war. By the spring of 1943, the Pacific War had shifted into a grinding contest of endurance. Each island taken meant another bloody step toward Japan, but the distances between those islands were staggering. Squadrons often launched before sunrise and returned after dark, their engines rumbling across thousands of miles of open water. In those conditions, the Lightning was no longer just an aircraft, it was a lifeline for both pilots and the strategy itself. One mission in particular captured what the P-38 could do. American intelligence had tracked Japanese bombers preparing to strike supply lines near New Guinea. The threat was severe. Without those supply lines, advancing ground forces would stall. The only chance was to intercept the bombers before they reached their targets. The range was daunting, farther than any American single-engine fighter could fly. But for the Lightning, it was within reach. A squadron of P-38s lifted into the humid air, climbing over mountain ranges, their long wings shimmering as dawn painted the horizon. Hours passed before they finally sighted dark shapes cutting through the clouds. Bombers, escorted by agile Zeros. The Japanese pilots assumed, as they always had, that they would have time to position themselves, that American fighters would arrive exhausted and short of fuel. Instead, the Lightnings dove in with brutal speed. The first bursts from their nose guns shredded engines, flames erupting across wings. Zeros spun to engage, but every time they turned, the Lightning pilots refused to play their game. Instead of twisting in endless circles, they climbed steeply, rolled, then came down like hammers, using gravity and horsepower to their advantage. When the surviving Japanese aircraft limped back to their bases, the realization was dawning. The Americans had something new, something that could not be dismissed as clumsy. Reports described the Lightning as fast, ruthless, and relentless. For the first time, Japanese air commanders worried not just about defending their bombers, but about whether they could risk sending them at all. The psychological effect on American crews was just as profound. Until then, many had flown missions half expecting to be outmatched. They carried with them the memory of the early months of the war, when Japanese dominance in the sky seemed unquestionable. But after flying the Lightning, after returning from missions with victories instead of funerals, the mood shifted. The aircraft was not just protecting them, it was giving them the power to strike back. And then came the mission that would define the Lightning's legend: the interception of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. In April 1943, codebreakers revealed that the mastermind of Pearl Harbor would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville on an inspection tour. The opportunity was extraordinary and perilous. The route was deep in enemy territory, across nearly 1,000 miles of open ocean. No other fighter could attempt such a strike. But the P-38 could. 18 Lightnings roared off their airstrip in Guadalcanal, each carrying extra fuel tanks, their pilots briefed to the last detail. 4 hours they flew low, skimming the waves to avoid detection. Finally, on schedule almost to the minute, the formation spotted a small cluster of Japanese aircraft. Yamamoto's bomber flanked by Zeros. The Lightnings climbed, then pounced. Nose guns blazed. The bombers spiraled into the jungle below, crashing in flames. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's early victories, was dead. The mission shocked the Japanese command. If their most guarded figure could be hunted down in the middle of his empire, nowhere was safe. And it was the P-38 that had made it possible. No other aircraft could have flown the distance, carried the fuel, and struck with such precision. For the Japanese, it was more than a loss of a commander, it was a shattering of confidence. For the Americans, it was proof that the Lightning was more than a machine. It was a strategic weapon, a force capable of changing the course of the war. After Yamamoto's death, the Japanese began to regard the twin-tailed silhouette with a mixture of fear and respect. Pilots who had once boasted about their Zero's agility now admitted privately that the Lightning was a predator they could not easily escape. Its long reach meant there was no sanctuary, no distant base beyond its grasp. At the same time, the Lightning was reshaping the way American pilots thought about air combat. No longer were they simply flying defense for bombers. They were hunters, sweeping ahead of the bomber streams, clearing the skies, and attacking targets of opportunity on the ground. The Lightning could dive on airfields, strafe ships, and then climb away before enemy defenses could react. It became a constant pressure on Japanese forces, a reminder that the Americans were not only coming, they were already there day after day, grinding away at both machinery and morale. The mocking laughter that had greeted the Lightning in Europe had evaporated. In its place was silence, then grudging admiration, and finally fear. Because the P-38 had shown that war in the Pacific was not just about turning ability or short bursts of speed. It was about endurance, reach, and overwhelming firepower. The Lightning embodied all of these, and it was rewriting the very definition of air superiority. And yet, the story was not finished. The Japanese were adapting, building new aircraft, training fresh pilots. Each battle was still deadly, each mission a gamble. But from 1943 onward, the Pacific War could never again be described as a one-sided fight. The balance was shifting, and the P-38 Lightning was at the heart of that change. By late 1943, the Pacific Air War had become a struggle not just of machines, but of endurance and imagination. The Japanese still possessed formidable numbers of aircraft, and their pilots, though increasingly young and less experienced, fought with the ferocity of men defending their homeland's farthest outposts. But against them now swept squadrons of P-38 Lightnings, and the nature of combat was changing. One of the Lightning's most significant advantages was altitude. Where the Zero thrived in low to mid-level maneuvering, the P-38 excelled at the heights. American commanders began planning missions that leveraged this fact. Rather than meeting Japanese fighters and twisting dogfights near the surface, the Lightnings took position miles above, waiting for the right moment to dive. The roar of twin engines in a high-speed plunge became the harbinger of destruction. Pilots described the sensation of pressing forward on the yoke, feeling the aircraft gather speed as the horizon tilted, then unleashing a torrent of fire that ripped through enemy formations in seconds. Japanese crews were bewildered. They were accustomed to controlling engagements, circling their foes into tight duels, exploiting agility. Now they faced opponents who refused to play by those rules. The Lightning dictated the terms of battle. It could appear suddenly from above, strike with overwhelming force, and vanish again into the sky. The psychological impact was devastating. Enemy pilots began looking upward more than outward, dreading the dark silhouettes that might at any moment drop upon them. On the American side, tactics evolved rapidly. Pilots developed the boom and zoom style, striking quickly then climbing back to altitude, where their superior power gave them dominance. Even when outnumbered, Lightnings could survive by refusing to become entangled, instead slashing through enemy groups and retreating to safety before they could be encircled. Squadrons that once feared Japanese traps now turned those traps into opportunities, drawing the enemy out only to hammer them from above. But the Lightning was more than a sky duelist. Its versatility made it indispensable in every aspect of the Pacific campaign. With its long range, it could escort bombers striking deep into Japanese-held territory. With its concentrated firepower, it could devastate ships attempting to reinforce garrisons. With its rugged airframe, it could absorb punishment and still bring pilots home. Missions often stretched to 8, even 10 hours, journeys across vast stretches of ocean where there was no forgiveness for error. Crews would return dehydrated, exhausted, sometimes half delirious. Yet again and again the Lightnings carried them through. Perhaps nowhere was the aircraft's value clearer than during the battles for the Solomon Islands. These remote strips of land were stepping stones toward the heart of Japan's empire, and control of the air above them meant control of the seas below. Japanese forces threw everything they had into defending the islands, sending wave after wave of fighters and bombers. The Lightning met them head-on. In one massive engagement, American bombers heading for Bougainville were swarmed by dozens of Japanese aircraft. Normally, such an attack would spell disaster. But escorting them were P-38s, which dove into the attackers with lethal precision. Gunfire from their noses cut through bomber formations, scattering them in flames. Zeros tried desperately to counter, but the Lightnings refused to engage in prolonged turning battles. Instead, they climbed, regrouped, and struck again from above. By the time the bombers reached their targets, the skies behind them were littered with wreckage. Losses were heavy, for the Japanese. For the Americans, it was proof that the Lightning could deliver bombers safely across some of the most dangerous skies in the world. Word of these victories traveled fast. Letters from pilots described how the once mocked twin-tailed plane was becoming a lifeline. Families back home began hearing about the Lightning with pride, clipping newspaper articles that spoke of daring intercepts and improbable long-range missions. For the men flying it, the aircraft was more than a tool. It was a companion, one they trusted with their lives, one that carried them back when chance and enemy fire should have ended their journeys. Meanwhile, the Japanese command grew increasingly desperate. They attempted to develop new tactics, to lure the Lightnings into close combat, to ambush them at lower altitudes. But the Americans had learned their lessons. Discipline became the rule. Never turn with a zero, always fight on your own terms, always trust the Lightning's speed and power. Slowly, methodically, the kill ratios tilted. Losses that once crippled Allied squadrons were now being inflicted on the Japanese instead. And as the balance shifted, something deeper began to happen. Japanese pilots, once the masters of the Pacific sky, began losing faith. Reports filtered back of units decimated, of bombers destroyed before reaching their targets, of Lightnings appearing where they should not have been able to reach. The legend of invincibility that had carried the Zero through the early war was broken. Confidence turned to doubt, and doubt in combat is fatal. The P-38 had not just matched its enemy, it had changed the very psychology of the air war. It proved that victory did not require following the enemy's script. It proved that endurance, power, and careful tactics could overcome agility and tradition. Above all, it proved that the Americans could not only contest the skies of the Pacific, they could dominate them. Yet this dominance came at a cost. Long missions left men drained, pushing their endurance to the edge. Mechanical failures, though less common, still claimed lives when luck ran out. Enemy pilots, even as their numbers dwindled, continued to fight with courage and desperation. Every flight carried risk. But the men who flew the Lightning accepted those risks because they knew what their aircraft could do. They had seen it with their own eyes. By the close of 1943, the P-38 Lightning had transformed from an object of mockery into the sharp edge of America's air strategy. It was the hunter in the vast Pacific, the guardian of bombers, the terror of enemy airmen. And as the war pushed closer toward Japan itself, its legend was only just beginning. As 1944 dawned, the Pacific War entered a new phase. The Allies were no longer simply fighting for survival or clawing for footholds. They were advancing island by island across the ocean. The Lightning, by now tested in countless missions, became the spearpoint of that advance. Its twin tails were as familiar in Pacific skies as the sunrise itself, a constant reminder that the tide of war had turned. In the campaign for the Philippines, the P-38 showed its full potential. Japan knew the islands were a lifeline, both strategically and symbolically. Losing them would mean a direct path toward the homeland. They threw their air forces into the fight, determined to repel the American push. But waiting for them were the Lightnings, ready to escort massive bomber streams and to sweep ahead in aggressive patrols. One mission after another proved the value of long range. Where other fighters would have run dry of fuel, the Lightning pressed on. It could fly from bases hundreds of miles away, strike Japanese airfields, and return without refueling. This ability created an effect that went beyond the battlefield. It shattered Japanese planning. Bases once thought secure, far beyond fighter reach, were suddenly vulnerable. Pilots who had once relaxed after crossing a certain line now realized there was no line. The Lightning could find them anywhere. Stories spread among American crews about the Lightning's resilience. Some pilots limped home with engines shot out, holes punched through wings, even tails partially severed. Mechanics patched them up, and within days the aircraft was flying again. This toughness fostered a sense of invincibility among its crews. They believed the Lightning would not abandon them, and belief in war is as valuable as armor. But while the Lightning dominated the skies, the Japanese response grew darker. Depleted of experienced pilots, they began relying more heavily on raw recruits. Many lacked proper training. Others were thrust into combat with only hours of flight time. Against the disciplined Lightning squadrons, their chances were slim. Losses mounted with brutal speed. In desperation, Japanese commanders began to consider extreme measures. The introduction of kamikaze tactics in late 1944 was a sign of this desperation. Where fighter duels could no longer guarantee results, Japan turned to sacrifice. Yet even here the Lightning played its part. Squadrons of P-38s were tasked with intercepting kamikaze formations before they reached American ships. The missions were tense, deadly races against time. Pilots described the horror of seeing aircraft dive directly toward the fleet, flames trailing behind them, and the grim relief when their own gunfire shredded those threats before impact. The Lightning, built for endurance and interception, proved invaluable in this new tragic phase of the war. Back home in America, the image of the P-38 was changing as well. Magazines featured photographs of its distinctive silhouette. Newsreels showed formations sweeping across endless skies. Pilots returning from the Pacific spoke of its speed, its range, and its unmatched firepower. Once the Flying Fork ridiculed in Europe, it was now celebrated as the fork-tailed devil feared across Japan. Public perception mirrored the battlefield. What had begun as doubt had become awe. Still, for the men who flew it, the Lightning was not a legend but a daily companion. They knew its quirks, the tendency to compress at high speeds in dives, the need to manage its engines carefully in tropical heat, the long hours spent alone over the ocean. They also knew its strengths, the way its concentrated nose guns shredded anything in their path, the way its twin engines offered a margin of safety over hostile waters, the way it could carry them farther than any other fighter. These details, lived and felt in every mission, gave the aircraft a personality almost human. The Japanese, meanwhile, faced the unrelenting pressure of its presence. Reports described bombers turned back before reaching targets, patrols wiped out before completing their missions, and reinforcements decimated while still en route. The Lightning had become more than a plane, it was a symbol of inevitability. To see its twin tails glinting in the sun was to know that the Americans were coming, and nothing could stop them. By the summer of 1944, as American forces closed on the Marianas and prepared for the next great leap toward Japan, the Lightning was everywhere. It escorted the massive B-29 bombers on their long, punishing raids. It prowled over shipping lanes, hunting convoys and transports. It dived onto airstrips, blasting grounded planes before they could take off. Every mission reinforced the same truth. The aircraft once mocked as clumsy had become the defining hunter of the Pacific. And yet, within this triumph lay a subtle irony. In Europe, where its career had faltered, the Lightning was gradually overshadowed by other fighters, most notably the P-51 Mustang. In the Pacific, however, it was irreplaceable. Range was king and the Lightning wore that crown. German pilots might still have laughed at its strange shape, but in the Pacific no one was laughing anymore. By the time American forces stood at the gates of the Philippines and beyond, the Lightning had carved its legend deep into the war. For the Japanese, it was a harbinger of defeat. For the Americans, it was proof that ingenuity, persistence, and adaptability could turn mockery into mastery. And for the pilots who flew it, the Lightning was not just a machine but a partner. Sometimes temperamental, often exhausting, but always there when it mattered most. This was the final shock in the chain. The recognition that the aircraft dismissed as unfit for Europe had, in the Pacific, become indispensable, feared, and respected. The war in the skies was no longer a contest of equals. It was a relentless hunt, and the hunter bore two tails. What happens when disbelief shatters in an instant? For the Japanese pilots who once dismissed the P-38, the answer came not as a slow realization but as a sudden, crushing collapse of confidence. The transition was stark. 1 month they believed they could outfly, outfight, and outlast. The next they were scanning the skies in dread for a flash of silver and the unmistakable twin tails cutting across the sun. The turning point arrived in the skies above the Philippines, where massive Allied fleets and air formations gathered for the push back into Southeast Asia. Japan, desperate to hold ground, launched sortie after sortie. Young pilots, many with barely 30 hours of training, were thrown into cockpits to face seasoned Americans. Their leaders reassured them that the Lightning was cumbersome, that it could not turn sharply, that its engines made it sluggish in dogfights. Those reassurances dissolved the moment tracers streaked past their canopies. American pilots had learned by then to use the P-38's unique gifts. They did not try to dance in tight spirals with nimble Japanese fighters. Instead, they exploited altitude, diving with ferocious speed, firing bursts from their clustered guns, and then climbing away before the enemy could react. The effect was devastating. An opponent might see the Lightning for only a few seconds, framed by the roar of cannon fire, and then it was gone, leaving wreckage in its wake. To the men on the ground, the sky itself seemed to split open. Farmers in the Philippines described hearing a shriek overhead, looking up to see two silver lines diving straight down, then flames blossoming as Japanese planes spiraled earthward. Soldiers huddled in trenches reported the sound of concentrated gunfire, short, brutal rips like cloth being torn apart. And then silence, broken only by the thunder of another Lightning passing overhead. For Japanese commanders, reports piled up with a grim consistency. Squadrons sent to intercept bombers did not return. Recon flights vanished without trace. Even attempts at ambush, where fighters waited low over the ocean for incoming bombers, ended with ambushers themselves annihilated. The P-38 had turned the psychological battlefield upside down. What was once considered safe airspace was now contested. What was once secure timing was now vulnerable. The collapse of certainty is often more dangerous than the loss of men or machines. A pilot who believes his aircraft inferior fights at a disadvantage before even taking off. By late 1944, many Japanese aviators entered combat expecting defeat. Some went aloft whispering quiet farewells. Others pressed themselves into reckless attacks, knowing survival was unlikely. The Lightning's dominance fed this spiral of despair, making every encounter more lopsided than the last. At the same time, American pilots experienced the opposite transformation. Their confidence soared. They described a feeling of being the hunter, not the hunted. Mission logs from squadrons in the Pacific recorded kill ratios that once seemed impossible. Crews who had faced deadly odds in earlier years now felt the balance shift in their favor. They were no longer merely surviving, they were dictating the battle. One pilot recalled returning from a long-range escort, his formation intact, bombers unscathed, and thinking, "We finally own the sky." That sense of ownership was not arrogance but relief. Years of brutal losses had conditioned them to expect the worst. Now, escorted by the Lightning, they saw their missions succeed. Factories burned, convoys shattered, islands secured, all because the skies were cleared first. The climax of this transformation came during the liberation of the Philippines. For Japan, this was supposed to be a last stand, a defense of territory vital to its empire. Instead, the air over the islands became a proving ground for American dominance. Lightnings escorted bombers on deep strikes against shipping lanes, cutting supply chains. They prowled over enemy fields, destroying aircraft before they could even taxi. And they intercepted reinforcements in mid-flight, breaking them apart with merciless efficiency. By now, Japanese pilots had stopped laughing at the twin tails. The very sight of them carried a weight of inevitability. Accounts from survivors spoke of the dread they felt when they saw the P-38 approaching. Dread not just of death but of futility. To fight and lose is one thing, to fight knowing you will lose is another entirely. In those skies, the mockery once aimed at the Lightning became a bitter memory. The same design once called awkward had become the instrument of collapse. The laughter that echoed in European airfields had no place here. Instead, there was only silence, broken by the roar of engines and the sound of gunfire raining down from above. By the final months of 1944, the P-38 Lightning was no longer just a tool of war. It had become a symbol, a harbinger that Japanese pilots read like an omen of doom. Each time its distinctive outline appeared against the clouds, it told a story. The old balance of the skies was gone, and the empire's defenders were fighting in borrowed time. The collapse showed itself not just in air battles, but in the rhythms of the entire war. Convoys that once dared to creep across the Pacific now huddled close to shorelines, moving only under cover of darkness. Supply bases hidden deep in jungles received fewer and fewer deliveries, because the Lightnings prowled relentlessly, hunting transports with the same hunger they showed for fighters. The Japanese High Command had once considered its outer ring of islands a defensive wall. By late 1944, that wall looked more like a sieve. In dogfights, the shift was even clearer. The once feared Zero, with its agility and grace, had lost the advantage it held in the early years. When Zeros tried to lure Lightnings into tight spirals, the American pilots refused the bait. Instead, they stayed high, dove fast, and struck with punishing force. Burst after burst of concentrated fire poured from the nose of the Lightning, cutting through enemy formations in seconds. And when the Japanese tried new tactics, mass attacks, head-on charges, or ambushes from above, the P-38's speed and firepower shattered those efforts before they could succeed. Pilots who once believed in their invincibility now faced a cruel reversal. Survival became a matter of chance, not skill. Veterans who had scored victories earlier in the war found themselves outmatched by younger American flyers, not because their own abilities had dulled, but because the Lightning had tilted the scales so heavily. The psychological weight of this cannot be overstated. For years, the Japanese fighter force had been built on pride, on the myth of the unbeatable pilot and the uncatchable Zero. That myth gave young men courage to climb into cockpits against impossible odds. But myths are fragile when tested by relentless reality. Each lost squadron, each failed interception, chipped away at that illusion until it collapsed entirely. Meanwhile, for the Americans, the P-38 represented proof that the tide had turned irreversibly. They knew the Lightning had weaknesses. It was not invincible, not the perfect aircraft. Yet what mattered was not perfection, but dominance where it counted. It could fly farther, hit harder, and return home when others could not. For the men who flew it, the Lightning became more than a machine. It became a partner in survival, an ally that gave them the confidence to keep pressing forward into hostile skies. The moment of absolute recognition came during the battles over Leyte Gulf. Here, Japan launched its desperate effort to halt the American return to the Philippines, throwing aircraft, ships, and men into the largest naval battle of the war. But while the fleets clashed at sea, the skies told a parallel story. Squadrons of P-38s cut through Japanese reinforcements, shredding convoys and smashing airfields before they could mount coordinated strikes. In mission after mission, the Lightnings cleared paths for bombers, intercepted kamikazes before they reached the fleet, and made every Japanese sortie a gamble with death. For the men on the ground, the effect was unmistakable. Soldiers on landing beaches looked up and saw the twin tails above, knowing that their supply ships and convoys would be guarded. Officers planning operations counted on the Lightning's reach, confident that distant targets could be struck. And for commanders, the presence of these aircraft meant freedom of action, a guarantee that the skies would bend to American will. By the end of 1944, the laughter that had greeted the P-38's arrival in Europe was not only silenced, it was inverted. The aircraft once mocked as awkward had become the predator that haunted Japanese skies. The very shape that inspired ridicule, the twin tails, the central cockpit, now inspired dread because it meant speed, firepower, and inevitability. This was the climax, the moment when perception caught up with reality. The war had shifted decisively not because of a single machine alone, but because of what that machine represented. Adaptability, endurance, and the relentless pressure of an enemy who had learned how to fight smarter. The Lightning's story is not just about engineering. It is about the transformation of belief, from arrogance to fear, from doubt to dominance. And as the Pacific War surged into its final stages, that transformation set the stage for what came next. The collapse of Japanese air confidence, the loss of the Zero's mystique, and the rise of Allied control of the skies, all of it paved the way for victory. But the echoes of this change went beyond the battlefield, reshaping the way pilots, commanders, and nations thought about air power itself. When the smoke cleared over the Pacific and the front lines pushed steadily toward Japan, the story of the P-38 Lightning had already transcended the realm of machinery. It was no longer just a twin-engine fighter with heavy guns and long wings. It had become a lesson, etched in fire and steel, about how quickly fortunes in war can change and how arrogance often invites its own defeat. For Japanese pilots, the transformation was devastating. Many who had once believed themselves heirs to an invincible tradition found themselves scattered across the ocean, their aircraft reduced to wreckage. Letters recovered from downed aviators spoke not only of courage but of despair. One young flyer, writing before his final mission, confessed that he no longer believed in victory, only in sacrifice. The myth of the unchallenged Zero had collapsed, and with it the confidence of those who fought beneath its banner. In contrast, American flyers returned from missions with a new sense of purpose. Where once they had braced themselves for heavy losses, now they felt empowered by the presence of the Lightning. They trusted its range, relied on its durability, and exploited its firepower. For them, the P-38 was not simply a machine. It was a lifeline, a companion that carried them across hostile skies and back home again. Many described a bond with the aircraft that blurred the line between man and machine, as if the Lightning itself shared their determination. On the broader stage, the Lightning reshaped strategic thinking. Before its arrival, long-range escort was a dream. Commanders either sent bombers without protection or risked fighters running out of fuel before reaching their targets. The P-38 broke that barrier. It proved that a fighter could fly farther, strike harder, and still survive the punishment of war. That lesson carried forward, influencing designs that would dominate the next generation of air combat. But perhaps the most important transformation was psychological. Wars are not only contests of weapons and numbers, they are battles of belief. By stripping away the aura of Japanese air superiority, the P-38 eroded the morale of an entire system built on pride and myth. And by giving American pilots renewed confidence, it fueled a momentum that accelerated the war's end. In that sense, the Lightning did more than shoot down planes, it dismantled illusions and replaced them with reality. The echoes reached beyond the combatants themselves. For islanders who lived under Japanese occupation, the sight of twin-tailed aircraft overhead became a symbol of hope. Farmers in the Philippines, villagers in New Guinea, and resistance fighters scattered across Southeast Asia all learned to associate the Lightning with the possibility of liberation. It was not just an American machine, it was, in their eyes, a messenger of change. And yet, as with all wartime technologies, the Lightning's story is not simple triumph. Behind every victory lay tragedy. The same missions that secured skies also brought destruction to towns, convoys, and soldiers below. Civilians caught in the crossfire often paid the price for strategies that depended on air supremacy. The roar of the Lightning's engines, inspiring to some, was terrifying to others who knew it meant bombs or gunfire were close behind. This duality is what makes the story of the P-38 more than a tale of engineering. It forces us to ask difficult questions. What does it mean to turn a machine of ridicule into a weapon of dominance? How do we weigh the relief of liberated soldiers against the sorrow of destroyed homes? And how do pilots reconcile pride in their victories with the cost those victories inflicted? By late 1944, those questions lingered in the minds of men on both sides. Japanese survivors struggled with guilt and loss, wondering if their sacrifices had meaning. American veterans, even in their triumph, carried memories of missions where comrades never returned. For all its effectiveness, the Lightning could not shield them from the reality that every battle meant lives cut short. The P-38's transformation from mockery to mastery thus became a mirror reflecting the contradictions of modern war. It showed that innovation could reverse fortunes, but also that victory carried shadows. It proved that confidence could crumble in weeks, and that despair could just as quickly turn into dominance. And it reminded everyone who witnessed its rise that machines alone do not win wars. It is the human beliefs attached to them that shape history.